I want to first explain a little bit about Chautauqua because these young performers are held to the same standards as the professional performers that you will meet tonight on this stage. First and foremost, it is their job to accurately and thoroughly research a historical figure, understand their historical context, take an entire lifetime, a whole biography, and shrink it down to 15 minutes. Take factual information and turn it into an engaging narrative that is pleasing to you, their audience. The Chautauqua performance is in 3 parts. First, your character will tell their story in their words, and then they will answer questions while still in character. And lastly, you will be able to ask questions of the researcher and performer. So start thinking about those now. I first worked with Cambria Henson at the East Middle School Challenge program in the spring. The Young Chautauqua program is one of Colorado Humanities programs, and it was introduced to the District 51 in 2004 under the amazing and talented Susan Marie Franchek and the diligent, tireless, and passionate Susan Hall. The program continues. It has even survived COVID, and we look forward to being able to serve more schools in the future. So Miss Cambria Henson, our first meeting, mentioned that her character was Eleanor Roosevelt. And I could feel that she already had a real connection to this character. And as the semester went on and we worked together, I just had my fingers crossed that she would want to continue her studies through the summer and be willing to present to you tonight. She is no stranger to the stage. In fact, she will be performing as Cruella de Vil at the end of this month here in town. I do want to really make this clear. This is a voluntary program. What she's done with me since finishing the project, which was the finale, was a performance in her class in May, she's chosen to stick with this. And she started 9th grade this year out at Central High School. And some of you maybe think back to that transition from middle school to high school. It's a pretty big deal. And she chose to continue this for fun. I simply adore this young lady. So, the year is 1954. You and I are guests at a League of Women Voters luncheon where Eleanor Roosevelt is going to speak to us about the importance of service. Eleanor Roosevelt, in addition to being First Lady, has many accomplishments of her own. She is a humanitarian, an equal rights activist, a woman's rights activist, and a mother. I polled you all earlier asking what was the most important thing you wanted us to ask of Eleanor Roosevelt today, and I have your answer. Mrs. Roosevelt, thank you for joining us today, and we would all like to know, what would you like most out of life?
Thank you. I would say the opportunity for doing something useful. For in no other way, I'm convinced, can true happiness be attained. I remember the terrifying but enticing moments that led me to step out of my place of being a woman, especially the president's wife. Well, of course I wasn't always the First Lady. I was once just a young mother and wife, following the rules of society. In the spring following my marriage to Franklin, I gave birth to my first child, Anna. Truth to be told, I never really knew how to be the homemaker everyone expected young mothers to be. I had a very rough upbringing, so I had no sense of this new direction of motherhood. My mother died when I was young and my father shortly after, so I had no role models of mother or wife. I gave birth to James, and then Franklin Jr. Franklin Jr. came down with influenza and passed shortly after. He was just a baby, only an infant. A mother losing a child is something I cannot put into words, a heavy feeling on my chest. I wasn't sure I wanted any more children, but only 10 months after his death, I gave birth to my son, Elliot. I was 26 and a mother of 3 when Franklin became New York State Senator. It was very stressful. Talking with the citizens of Albany and Franklin's colleagues, I became so interested in what they had to say. I was beginning to get curious in human beings, and I found that almost everyone had something interesting to contribute to my education. This effort was to try to be a good wife to Franklin. It was a wife's duty to be interested in whatever interested her husband, whether it was politics, books, or a particular dish for dinner. My social life and schedule was becoming much overwhelmed with dinners and outings with the people that Franklin introduced to me. It was demanding, but lively. War broke out in Europe, and Germany began to attack our ships. There was a sense of impending disaster hanging over all Americans. Everyone wanted to hear the address of President Wilson, and when Franklin got me a seat, with great difficulty, I listened breathlessly and returned home half dazed by the sense of impending change. In April of 1917, World War I entered the United States. Many men left to fight in the war, and so the women left at home had to step up. I dove into volunteering for the American Red Cross. They had canteens, and they were placed at railroad junctions. There I would rise early when the air was still chilly and would end when the sun crept behind the horizon. I would rise about 5 a.m. to make and serve jam sandwiches and coffee for the men working in the war. One day, I tested my limits. I was using the bread slicing machine. All of a sudden, I sliced my finger. It looked like it had cut all the way to the bone. I was in so much shock and pain, but I knew I had to keep working. This would heal, and these war efforts needed to be done. I grabbed a handkerchief and hoped it would cease bleeding, but the red blood soaked handkerchief after handkerchief. I worked the rest of that day until I could see a doctor later that evening. I'm too stubborn to just give up. While working in the canteen, I decided that I wanted to do more for the war efforts. So I volunteered at the Naval Hospital and tended for the injured men after their service in the war. I went from working just a few days a week to having a full week full of war efforts. One day, James, my second eldest, wrote in a letter to my mother-in-law, "Don't you think Mother should not go so early?" Although I found it silly, all his complaining, it was hard to be a mother and volunteering. My kids didn't often have a mother who would cook and play with them. That's forever one of my biggest regrets. The feeling of family and home clouded my mind as I worked. That's why I'm so thankful for my mother-in-law, who so often cared for my children. I loved my war work. It brought such unexpected satisfaction because I loved having a purpose. In November of 1918, the war to end all wars finally came to an end. The feeling of relief and thankfulness settled over my body. So many men had died or gotten injured. So peace settled over my body that no more men or families would have to go through that. I imagined my boys having to go through that.
You still there?
The dark, cold trenches, the heavy-handedness of war and work, being so far away from family, from home, from warmth. I was so thankful it had finally come to an end. Franklin decided to run for president a couple years later. I was elated for him to step into such a big position, but nervousness ran through my veins. It was 1920, the first year that women could vote. I went with him along the campaign trail as he enthusiastically greeted all the citizens. Unfortunately, Franklin lost the election that year. But I decided that this was going to be the year I was more independent. So I joined the League of Women's Voters to help with whatever I could. Unfortunately, Franklin got sick with polio. There was no effective cure or vaccine at the time, so he just had to suffer. After hospital stays and painful therapy, he was left wheelchair-ridden. Although this was a difficult time for my family and I, we came out stronger. While Franklin was ill, I stepped in for him at work. Politics were a whole different world than I had imagined. When the men would have meetings, the women would have to stand outside the closed doors. It was disheartening to me. I was secluded from something so important to me. Not only did my feet ache from standing, but I felt like women were trapped in a cage, only allowed to see and not to engage. I knew that this had to be different. In the 1932 election, my husband beat Herbert Hoover for presidency. I was elated for him to step into this big role, but the United States was in a very troubling time. It was in its fourth year of the Great Depression, and it had completely rattled the country. Hundreds of thousands of Americans had lost their jobs. Thousands of banks had failed, and homeless and starving people lined the streets. The world seemed gray with no color or life. But the president and I had an important mission. We were going to try to get our home, our America back, after such a tremendous loss. In the first 100 days of Franklin's time in the Oval Office, he launched a tremendous legislative program to help get the nation to a better place financially. He wasn't the only one that could help, though. I had to try, at least. Me and my great friend and colleague, Lorena Hickok, and I decided that we were going to try something big. On March 6th, just 2 days after Franklin's inauguration, we held the first all-women's press conference. I felt like women were so excluded from the news of the world, and they needed to hear and be heard. In my 12 years in the White House, I held 348 press conferences. One of my goals with these press conferences was to inform the women generally and politically of the nation. Another one of my goals was to help the women of the nation form a general attitude of mind and thought. Men saw this as girlish and used to gossip. For example, Delbert Clark, Washington Bureau of the New York Times, stated that I was making the women incompetent because I was coddling them. But I was doing the opposite. I was trying to empower them. I didn't let anyone in the White House do anything for me. I ran the elevator for myself, I moved furniture, and Secret Service didn't have anything to do for me. I was independently my own woman, just Mrs. Roosevelt. I didn't deserve anything just because I was the president's wife. I loved my work as First Lady. I did radio interviews, talked to people, and even had my own newspaper column called My Day, and I wrote every word myself. Oh, and I also remember the letters. I love the letters. Hundreds and thousands of people sent me letters asking for my advice, and I replied to them with my greatest of heart. One of my efforts was to help the women who were unemployed after the Great Depression and the end of World War I. Due to the end of the war, the men had come back and the women had lost their place in wartime jobs. And then, due to the Great Depression, more women had lost their jobs and their place in the workforce. So I set up meetings with the White House to create a program to financially aid the women who needed jobs. Women weren't the only people that I could help, though. Colored people needed help. They were seen as inferior just because of the color of their skin. I attended the Southern Conference for Human Welfare in Birmingham, Alabama. I was disheartened to find out that black and white people could not sit together. I mean, this was a conference for human welfare. We were not supposed to be segregated. We were all just human. So I refused and sat down anyway. The police came and scolded me for what I was doing. You can't sit there. Black and white people are separate. You need to follow the segregation laws. But I wasn't going to listen to this. I stood up and grabbed my chair and placed it right in the middle aisle. Sitting down, a pit in my stomach and my ears red with anger. I wasn't going to stand for this. This meant equality, and they were not giving me that. A few weeks later, the Daughters of the American Revolution denied access to black artists in Constitution Hall for performances. I loved the Daughters of the American Revolution. I was a member, and I loved everything they were doing, but they did something so contrary to my beliefs. So I had to resign. All these efforts were used to stand for equality. That was my main goal as First Lady and as a human being, was equality for all. I'm so thankful for the opportunities that being First Lady brought to me. We could talk about World War II or the rest of Franklin's time in the Oval Office, but we just don't have enough time. So that brings me to Franklin's sudden passing. I was devastated. I was all alone. I was just a mere 20 years old when I had become his wife, and we had been together for 38 years. I knew our children would miss him. America would miss him. But even on my own, I knew I had more to do. In November of 1948, I was elected part of the 18-chair Human Rights Commission. There, I worked tirelessly and had my other chair members do the same. We were creating something so world-changing. We were creating the Declaration of Human Rights. This declaration was to declare free rights for everybody. Free right of speech, fair trial, right of education. These things were so important to me. I had learned so much about them, from traveling the world, witnessing 2 world wars, and being the First Lady. After 2 years of hard work, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was proudly voted and adopted with great elation. It was one of my proudest works, and everything that I had learned from my years of life, I had put into this project. I had helped the nation, but I wanted to help the whole world become a better place and have equality. People often ask me for my advice, and this is something I have always tried to live by. You gain strength, courage, and confidence, and by which every opportunity you look fear in the face. You must do what you think you cannot do. Thank you for listening to my story, and if you have any questions, you may ask them now.
Were you related to Franklin before you became his wife?
She asked if I was related to Franklin before I became his wife. Yes, we were distant cousins from Theodore Roosevelt, so yes, we were related. Is there any more questions?
you deserve a great deal of credit for keeping your poise during the interruption.
Yeah.
Has to do with this. You obviously were a mentor for hundreds of thousands of women in the time that you were alive. Who was your mentor?
He's asking who was my mentor. Well, I went to a school in France, and so my teacher was one of my greatest mentors, along with my, as I mentioned earlier, my friend and colleague Lorena Hickok. She was a really great mentor to me.
You said you were very independent and did things for yourself a lot in the White House, but were there any perks of being the First Lady that you did enjoy?
She's asking if I enjoyed any perks as being First Lady. Well, of course, it was a great honor. I think my power and voice, because being in the White House, you do get a little bit of recognition. And so being able to use my power to fight for equality, that was a great perk, because if I wasn't in that position, I feel like I would be less heard.
Very good.
Is there any more questions?
I just want to say you're awesome.
Okay. So now I'm the researcher, Cambria Henson. If there's any questions for me about my research or character or any interesting facts that I learned about her, you can ask them.
What year was that Human Rights Declaration, what year was it finally signed?
It was signed in 1950.
Okay.
So just a few years before kind of my current, now in the monologue.
Okay.
How much time did you spend researching this?
He asked how much time I spent researching my project. So I started in December of 2020 with my school. So I started researching Eleanor, and I've just been going on from there. Emily?
What was your favorite thing about Eleanor?
She asked what my favorite thing about Eleanor is. I would say she was a very interesting lady. She was very stubborn, which I'm also stubborn, and so I kind of related to that. And she was all just about accessibility, equality, which I also fight for.
How did you balance researching this with all of your academics and other extracurriculars?
She was asking how I balanced with school and academics and Chautauqua. I think it's all just about time management. I set aside time to research and revise my script. And so it was definitely a challenge, especially transitioning to high school. It's a big step. So I just learned to manage it.
One more. The back, yep.
What kind of sources did you use, and how did you identify what was fact from fiction and embellishment? So she was asking what kind of sources I used and what I found to be the most reliable and how I found that. I would say I used her autobiography, and I also used a biography of her. Through school, I have had kind of training to find what's a reliable source or not. So just using, her autobiography is a great source because it comes directly from her. Thank you.
Another round.